Okay, hi folks. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and welcome to our webinar on revitalizing political leadership. Um, we are having couple of technical issues getting a couple of our panelists on board here, but we're working on that. And in the meantime, we see a lot of attendees coming up, and that's nice. Welcome to everybody. Um, uh, I want to introduce our moderator and host and my friend and the inspiration behind this symposium here in a second. But I just want to take a minute to say uh, welcome. I'm glad you joined us. And I want to say a couple words about Democracy Journal in case you don't know it. I hope you do, but we've been around for 17 years now. And, we like to think that we are really at the leading edge in doing publishing symposia like this one that aren't just enmeshed in the politics of the moment and the grim things that are going on inside the Beltway, but that kind of try to look around corners and look into the future and try to reimagine our political discourse and our civic life. And I think this symposium does that quite well. And we were proud to work with Daniel Stid and the folks at Lyceum Labs and his partners to present this package of articles together. I met Daniel a little while ago, and a lot of people work on reinvigorating democracy and democracy reform, and often that takes the form of issues that are well known, like the Electoral College and thinking about the Supreme Court and other things. But I was always impressed by Daniel's approach, which is more outside Washington, more national in scope, more federal in scope, and looks at the question in very important ways that a lot of people don't. And that's what this symposium was about, and that's what this conversation was about. And hopefully we'll get the other two people in here. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel and thank Daniel and Debbie. And Daniel Stid, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's good to be here with you, and we are very grateful. The partners that prepared the essays for this symposium are really grateful to have had the opportunity that the Democracy, the Journal of Ideas, helped us pull together here. So we're grateful for the support and hosting there, and we're also grateful to kind of share with a few of the speakers, and we are planning to have a couple more join us. We're working to get them on now. Let me introduce myself. I'm the executive director of Lyceum Labs, which is a nonprofit project that's focused on really thinking about what would it take to revitalize political leadership and political parties in the United States. I also want to introduce our current co-panelists. It's wonderful to see you, Layla. Debbie Cox Bultan is the CEO of New Deal Leaders and the New Deal Forum. And we'll hear with each of these, our panelists, we'll give them a chance to talk more about what their organizations do when they arrive. And I'm also delighted to see Layla Zaidane, who's showed a lot of grace under pressure and bearing with the administrative arrangements to join us. Layla is the president and CEO of the Future Caucus. And we also will be joined here presently by Jim Townsend, who is the director of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne Law School. Now, let me just provide a little bit of framing for the conversation we want to have today and the conversation that, in effect, we've started in the symposium. And I'll propose three themes that in different ways and forms show up across the essays and will be at the heart of what we'll be talking about today. And the first is the theme of political leadership being essential to a healthy and functioning democracy. And we spend a lot of time, I think, especially these days, focusing on the problems with bad or leadership that's taking us in the wrong direction. And that's an important consideration in democracy, don't get me wrong, but we also need to be thinking about what does good look like and how do we get more leaders prompted by honorable ambition with the capacity to help lead our democracy. So the centrality of leadership, which I think over the years has been less central to thinking about democracy than, say, thinking about voters and other electoral reforms and the like. Those are important, but we also think leadership needs to be much more front and center. I think a second theme behind all of this work is the need to kind of look beyond what I've taken to calling the Thunderdome of our national politics, where the polarization and the kind of performative dimensions are often off the charts, to states and localities. It remains the case that ours is a remarkably decentralized democracy. Most of the governing that that impacts people's lives on a day-to-day basis, whether it's police or criminal justice or education or transportation, public health, what have you, all that's occurring for the most part at the state and local level. And thus, we want to be especially attentive to what's happening there. It's also the case, trust in government tends to be higher the closer government is to people. And we think it's possible for leaders to get things done in promising ways at those levels of government in the way that it might be increasingly elusive at the federal level. The third theme, which I would just mention here, is that there actually are a lot more leaders than we might surmise that are what we call leading to govern, leading in a practical, responsible way to solve problems in the public interest, especially at the state and local level. And we'll hear a range of stories and vignettes from folks today about those kinds of leaders. And a good bit of what we're trying to do here is to acknowledge and find ways to support those leaders, not least because that's how we feel like we can get the flywheel turning to have more talented people, especially in their 20s and 30s, raise their hands and come forward and run for office. So that's the backdrop for today. Why don't we just jump in here? And we'll do a couple of rounds of questions, then we'll open things up for Q&A. And Debbie, maybe we can start with you. Now, your essay for the symposium and also your terrific podcast, which I'd encourage people to subscribe to, looks at politics as an honorable profession. And that is in some ways countercultural. That's not the first word that comes into people's minds as they think about political leadership. So I'm just curious, what has led you to kind of swim against the tide of our culture in this respect? Why do you see politics as an honorable profession, and what have you found to be helpful in helping your fellow citizens kind of come to see it in the way you do? Maybe you could get us started with that question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's great to be with you, Daniel and Michael and Layla and everyone. I guess I would start by just saying that I've really always believed that politics is an honorable profession. I've been doing this for 30 years now. And my own journey into politics was one that had me searching for something where I felt like I could make a difference, and finding through, at a young age, through an internship on Capitol Hill, like a lot of us do, when I was in college, this world was opened up to me of people who were getting up every day and thinking about how they could make people's lives better. And that was really eye-opening to me. And the funny thing is that over 30 years of working with elected officials now in a variety of capacities, most recently for the last 15 with as CEO of New Deal and New Deal Forum, my opinion has not really changed that much. And it has been, I think what has changed, though, is my concern about the fact that so many people don't have that opinion. I led my article off with a little bit of a gimmick, but I actually was really curious when I started just to think about writing this article about what ChatGPT would say about politicians, and some of the words that came up when I searched were, corrupt and manipulative and incompetent. And I guess I wasn't shocked because, we all have friends and relatives that we talk to who ask us all the time how we can work in this business with those types of people. And so I know that there's that public sentiment, but that's just not been my experience. And so what I tried to do was both through our podcast and in this piece for the symposium was talk a little bit about why that's not been my experience working with elected officials over the last 30 years, and what instead I have found. And I think one of the reasons that it's so important to me right now is that I really see this connect between our inability to see elected officials as us, After all, when we talked about the Constitution, we the people, for the people, by the people, elected officials are the by the people part of that. This has always been a lesson in self-governance. And so this disconnect that somehow politicians are out there, not like us, in it for the wrong reasons, in it for fame and glory, really was, again, just kind of counter to how I have gotten to know hundreds of elected officials over the years, particularly at the state and local level, doing this work. And so, just to raise a couple of the misperceptions that I hear the most, and that I try to debunk, if you will, both again in our podcast and in this piece, is starting with just why people run for office, right? I mean, that's one of the things I hear the most is like, I just don't know why anyone would do that, and or if they're doing it, it's because they want to have some kind of glamorous life, which those of us who work with state and local elected officials know that is not not the case. It's not a glamorous life, but by far the reason that I hear more than anything else about why people run for office is because they want to make a difference, and that's really true almost to a person. Either they had something happen to them that they never want to happen to someone else. They see a problem in their community that they want to fix. I have a number of stories in the piece, but I'll tell one that's not in the piece, which is a conversation I had with the Senate president in Connecticut, Bob Duff, probably a couple of years ago now, and asking him about why he ran for office. And he talked about the fact that when he was a young boy, there was some issue in his neighborhood about a baseball field that needed fixing, and he wrote to his mayor as an elementary school kid, and got a letter back, and the fix happened. And that letter to this day still, is on his wall of the Senate, his Senate office. And it was that understanding that you could engage with your leadership of your city, you could make a difference by speaking up, got in his head from an early age that he wanted to do that too, and to help people. And so that story is really typical of what I hear from elected officials and why they get into this business in the first place. And then there's a number of other stereotypes, I would say, but I just would kind of leave it there for now, which is just to say that it feels very important to me in this moment, and really when I'm feeling like there really is a crisis of democracy, to just help shine light on who these people are, on stories of them delivering for their constituents, and to remind us all that we are them. And if we're going to kind of get to where we need to be beyond this crisis of democracy, we're going to have to, I think we're going to have to change the way we think about and talk about elected officials. You're muted, Daniel.
Thank you, Debbie. Really good to get that overview. Before we continue, Debbie, could you just give us, so people have a feel for the scale of your the range of the network you support, how many New Deal leaders are out there that have kind of benefited from the programs of the forum, and how many are you kind of working with at present at any given time?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So for those who don't know, New Deal stands for Developing Exceptional American Leaders. We are a national network of state and local elected officials below the level of governor that we invite to join and try to support them as they govern, both with idea sharing, with skill development, and just having a network of support. And so we keep our group at 200 at any given time very deliberately, so that it's a community of practice and they can learn from each other. So I think we're just over 200 right now. We fudge a little bit. And then we have people who have gone on to say run for Congress or run for governor, like Josh Shapiro or others, who are then alumni. And so folks who have gone through the program and are not currently elected officials, including Jim Townsend, who's one of our fellow panelists here, former New Deal leader. We have another, say, 200 or 300 of those folks. So it's a group of about 500 people who have governed, and then around them a whole ecosystem of like-minded people who are trying to help those folks govern successfully.
Got it. And I also want to extend a welcome to Jim Townsend, director of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne Law. Jim, thank you for bearing with us. I should also mention Jim was himself a state legislature in the state of Michigan. So good to have you with us, Jim. The next question, we'll let you catch your breath a little bit, and we'll turn to Layla, the president and CEO of the Future Caucus. And Layla, your organization, among other things it does, it works with And maybe you can kind of give us a feel at the outset of the numbers of state houses you're working in, but the healthy majority of state houses across the country working with kind of millennial and Gen Z lawmakers on a bicameral and bipartisan basis. I guess the question for you, and this gets at I think a concern we all have is the promise of with realizing the promise of these rising generations of leaders. You work closely with them on a day-to-day basis. What do you see them bringing to the table of our political life that older generations of leaders may not be in the same way or might not have the same aptitudes? And what do you see them contributing that's especially important for us right now?
Well, I love this question, and I hope the fact that I wasn't able to figure out the Zoom for a few minutes is not going to totally undermine my credibility as like the youth expert on this panel. I should have been able to figure out the IT, huh? But Future Caucus is really, I think, one of the bright spots, I would say, for folks looking at our democracy today and hopeful for what a healthier culture of policymaking could look like in the future. And so we were founded 10 years ago to work very intentionally with young Republicans and young Democrats to help, like New Deal leaders and several of the other organizations that were part of the symposium, to really equip young leaders, in our case, to effectively solve problems. And we thought that the best way to do that was to help them build relationships along a generational identity and not a partisan identity. And we saw that once they were able to build those strong working relationships across the aisle, and it would lead sort of naturally to working on policy solutions together, it sort of transcends the political polarization that is otherwise holding us back from tackling really, really critical national problems that our country is facing. And so we first launched a caucus in Congress, and since then have worked with state lawmakers across the country in 34 state houses to launch a Future Caucus chapter there. And since our inception, have been able to serve more than 1,800 young elected leaders who some are in state houses and some have gone on to run for mayor or Congress or other positions. And others are in civil society or contributing to sort of the healthy civic flywheel in other ways. And so, I think to your question, and probably a question on anyone's mind who maybe caught the debate last week and is wondering, like, what is it, are there young people out there who are ready to lead, and what could they bring to the table? I'm pleased to say that there is quite a bit of hope on the horizon, right? Analysis that we did showed that because of perhaps this resistance to being labeled or fitting neatly into one box, which as a millennial myself, I very much relate to that. And anyone who has perhaps a Gen Z child who is listening in on this conversation can relate to sort of the resistance that they would feel to just being like categorized black or white and anything. That actually is such a gift because it allows young people to build interesting coalitions in ways that is perhaps not intuitive in the way in which we think about politics today, which is so polarized and so factionalized. And young people, we did an analysis of this most recent legislative or completed legislative session. And although young people are about 25% of state legislators across the country, they are responsible for writing 40% of all of the bipartisan legislation that gets enacted. And so it's not just introduced, it's things that the governor is signing into law that goes into effect. And so, what that tells me is despite the fact that they are a small slice of lawmakers today, this capacity and this interest, right, in building coalitions or strange bedfellows is really translating into effective policy that is more representative of sort of a wider swath of interests within their districts. The thing about young people too that I would say is they're much less calcified into the status quo of how you have to do things or who you hold a grievance against, that maybe your colleague that you're just never going to sign on to their bill because of something they did 10 years ago. Not saying that it will all older lawmakers have that, but really you're going to be hard pressed to find that in sort of newly elected younger lawmakers. And so that creates a sense of openness and an ability to be creative and open to sort of innovative ways of moving forward, as we see sort of at the national level, really a political realignment. I think as young leaders are stepping into power, we're really seeing that come from that palpable sense that we feel at the grassroots is now entering the grass tops. And I, for one, am really excited about how that translates into sort of new ways of building bipartisan policy. And I guess the sort of last thing I'll say sort of about millennials and Gen Zers is you have to think like we grew up, I'm a millennial, I was born in the 80s, and I saw 9/11. I graduated into the Great Recession. I saw institution after institution that I believed in, that I was promised, fail. And so I have this, and like many millennials, have this real aspiration for our institutions to work. And yet I have evidence time and time again of it failing. Gen Z, on the other hand, really did, I think, have it even worse off than us. And while there's not that many Gen Zers in office today, there's about 75 at the state level. There's only one in Congress. Hopefully those numbers will grow. I think the thread that connects them is actually something that Debbie mentioned earlier about what she sees when she gets to work with elected leaders who have dedicated their lives to public service. It's this sense of agency, this sense of something feels broken, but I can fix it. And for me, that desire for talented young people who see a problem, who see our democracy or see an institution that is not delivering on its promise, to decide not to run away from the fire, but to run towards it. To me, that's quite inspiring. And then to see how effective they are once they show up, it tells me that we ought to be investing in their success once they show up across party lines in order to best deliver for our country.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Leigh. And I just want to double click on the points you made about the impressions, the generational impressions people have as they come of age as a parent of two millennials and two Gen Zers. Just realizing their experience of the country, its fortunes, what democracy entails, what it means is so different. I'm a late stage baby boomer, and I just realized just a profoundly different experience, and that brings different energy, different perspectives, different outlooks to bear. So I think that's critical. Jim, finally, we can turn to you here. And one of the premises of behind the symposium and the essays is that elected leadership is about many things, not least kind of mastering the nuts and bolts of the responsibilities of the job. And I think over the years, the Levin Center, in keeping with its namesake, Senator Carl Levin, has really emphasized the importance of effective oversight as a critical part of those nuts and bolts. And I'm just curious, what is the particular role that you see oversight playing in a healthy democracy, especially maybe as we're focusing on the state level here, and then also what are the skills and mindsets that the lawmakers you work with at the state level need to have to conduct oversight effectively?
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. And like Layla, I'm a little embarrassed by my troubles signing in. But I just want to say it's so great to see you and Debbie and Layla and Michael as well. So to answer your question, I think as far as the importance of this to democracy and this idea of working and trying to deal with sort of the workings of government, I think for us, we go back to really the way Senator Levin viewed these problems. He felt, and I had the privilege to work with him up until 2021 when he passed away, but he was very active as chairman of the Levin Center. And he felt so strongly that the problems we're facing in our democracy are not entirely, but they are partly an outgrowth of people's frustration with government's failure to deliver on its promises. And that we needed to put a focus on that through oversight, because congressional and legislative oversight at the state level can be such a powerful tool if it's wielded in good faith, if it's wielded in a bipartisan fashion, and if it's wielded in a way that is grounded in facts. Because, and I embrace everything that's been said, that what Debbie's mentioned, and when I came on, I unfortunately missed some of what you said, and certainly what you've just said, Layla. But really importantly in all of this is that facts have got to be at the core of our conversations. You know, we can have a new generation that has, you know, really promising expectations and capacities, but if they don't have a set of institutions and ways of working together that are not fact-based, we're nowhere. You know, we can't operate. So that's why we think this is so important, is it's partly about addressing people's frustrations by having better governance. And it's also about enabling us to have, through oversight at least, and hopefully other institutions, an ability to work together around facts and to try to use that as sort of, you know, those understandings or that kind of partnership as a way to start to build some new politics. So I think that's why this is important in our view. As far as the sort of way in which you know, the skills or the orientations that we're looking for, that we're finding in the field when we work with people, we have, you know, worked with hundreds and hundreds, I mean, probably 800 or 900 lawmakers and staff people, both in Congress and in states so far. And what I find is they come from all places and all political persuasions. And that's what's encouraging about this. I can cite a couple of examples that really struck me recently. I was doing some work in Salem, Oregon with the Oregon legislature and talking with them there. And they are really trying to rebuild their oversight capacity. And, you know, that's a very blue state. I mean, obviously. And they're very committed, though, to working across the aisle and trying to find ways to arrive at fact-based understandings of the issues and then fact-based solutions. And then, you know, a week later, a colleague of mine is in Nebraska, and he's talking and working closely with the Speaker of the unicameral legislature, which, of course, is a single chamber and ostensibly nonpartisan. But I think all of us, when we hear Nebraska, I think we realize that's a red state. And so John Arch is the Speaker of the unicameral, and I don't know when I've met a more committed public servant who is grounding everything he is doing in facts, and he is dedicated to working across the aisle. So what we're looking for here are people who are grounded in public service and in the what really it takes to deliver public services. I think one of the challenges with Congress is it's too easy to go to Washington and play the game, you know, play the social media and cable news game and not be accountable for delivering anything. That is not as easy to do at a state capitol.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're, you know, the strategy we're trying to employ is, yes, we're not ignoring Congress at all. We work closely, but we are trying to learn as much as we can about what kinds of values and what kinds of interests are animating these state leaders who are so dedicated to public service, to working across the aisle, and to enabling government to keep its promises.
No, thank you. I really appreciate, as I recall, the Levin Center, as part of its ongoing work, came to realize it wouldn't be sufficient just to work in Congress if more than half of the members of Congress got their start in state and local office. If the habits they're picking up of what it means to govern, if it's occurring at that level, then better habits would need to be developed at that level too. So I really appreciated the way that the Levin Center adjusted its approach, and I know that your resources for state level officials are really in high demand. Let's go a couple things here just by way of housekeeping. We're going to do one more kind of lightning round here of questions, then we're happy to open it up for the folks who are participating. For those of you in the audience, feel free if you have questions of anything that's come up so far or anything that strikes you in this next round, just drop your questions into the Q&A, and then we'll turn after this next round to questions from the floor for people. For this next round, and maybe if we can keep our answers here to just a couple of minutes apiece, then we'll have ample time for opening up for questions. And we've been talking about politics as an honorable profession, the new outlooks and perspectives that are more constructive that millennial and Gen Z lawmakers might be bringing, the imperative of oversight and what good it can do. So we've been looking at the upside of all this. Now we want to turn and kind of grapple with what we know are some of the obstacles and challenges. And Layla, maybe we could start with you. As you work with the members of your future caucuses and states across the country, what are the biggest barriers that they encounter or people that you might hope would be following in their footsteps from those same generational peer groups? What's keeping them at arm's length? We know that relative to younger generations and earlier cohorts, that younger people today look at politics as often the last thing they want to do. What are the big barriers that are keeping them kind of not jumping in, and what could be done to overcome them?
Yeah, it's funny, like Debbie, before I started writing this article, I also went to ChatGPT and I asked it, like, what do young people usually say they want to be when they grow up? I didn't think state legislator was going to be on there, but it took me multiple rounds to even get like any kind of politician of any kind. And I think to your question, Daniel, it's there are a lot of really good reasons why young children dream of being in the Olympics or being a teacher or a firefighter instead of being a public servant. And one of the things that we know, right, as a country is that it's really expensive to run for office. What I think we talk about less is that it's also really expensive to serve in office, especially at the state level. The average salary is $39,000 a year. And for a young person who's maybe still paying off student debt, who's thinking about buying a house or saving to start a family, it's really tough to make ends meet unless your partner has sort of a good salary or you come from wealth. And what that does is it really starts to squeeze out a bunch of really talented potential public servants who just can't make the math work. I was just recently talking to a young woman in North Dakota who is serving in her second term, and she was telling me because it's a part-time legislature and she doesn't earn enough to pay her rent for the full year, her second job, she's a college graduate, great degree, is a public servant elected by her peers. She's working as a bartender at a hotel, and she feels really disappointed that she's, not doing more with, that time of her life. But it's really hard to get full employment if your employer is going to say, oh, well, I have to let you go on PTO for 3 months out of the year, and then you have to leave for constituent services. So I think that's a really important conversation for us to have as we think about not just recruiting talent to the legislature, but retention of great talent in the legislature as well. Two other sort of points I think that are really important barriers that I hear from young lawmakers when I talk to them. The idea of a state legislator having a full staff of like 20 or 30 different people who all have specialized roles and are a well-oiled machine. Unfortunately, in most states, that is fiction. In places like Georgia, which, we hear about all the time nationally, lawmakers are at an 8-to-1 ratio with staff support, 1 staff to 8 lawmakers, which means that the legislator really is juggling a lot of competing responsibilities, doing a lot of the research, outreach, constituent services without a whole lot of external help. It's why I think, what Jim, Debbie, myself, a lot of our groups do is really vital because they depend on nonpartisan support in order to make their job and decision-making processes easier, just to make it all fit. The third thing that I'll add, and this is, probably the most insidious one, there are social media has certainly been a contributor to this. I think our political rhetoric has gotten very extreme, and unfortunately, sometimes that leads to threats or physical violence. Not to mention just, not necessarily being taken seriously by, potential voters or your colleagues when you show up and you're, 27 years old and they ask you like, hey, how old are you? Are you even allowed to run? But actually encountering voters or constituents who have been so angered by a particular issue or a particular vote that you feel like your life or your physical safety is under threat. And I think at the end of the day, if that happens enough, you as a young lawmaker might decide, this isn't worth it. It is not worth putting myself, my friends, my family in harm's way to do this job. And I think it's immeasurable to know the chilling effect that might have on other young lawmakers who look and see people who are relatable to them and who are unable to make it work. It really is discouraging for potential future talent pipeline.
Yeah, no, Layla, on that last point, I mean, I think one of the things, my own thinking in this field has gotten stuck here a little bit too, which is, the barriers that traditionally were preventing, people in their 20s and 30s from running, the sense that you couldn't get anything done, that it was hopelessly partisan, or that the money chase was corrupting. I mean, those are challenges, but there's a whole bunch of people who have kind of figured out how to get things done practically, how to work constructively with people who disagree with, and how to kind of solve the getting the flywheel turning on money. But I think the online vitriol and the sense of intimidation and threats that come in through those channels, I think especially heavily on women and people of color, kind of anyone who is in any way from a kind of historically a marginalized population or group. Those are real, and so I think that's something those of us working in this space need to grapple with. Jim, let me come to you. What are the biggest barrier that state lawmakers have when it comes to conducting more effective oversight? What are the obstacles that you see, and how is the Levin Center working to help them overcome those obstacles?
Well, Daniel, I'll simply just note what Layla has just said about the lack of resources and relatively low salaries and limited staff as being a major challenge. I think another thing, and I can talk about some things that we're doing to try to address that. Another issue is just simply the complexity of our system. So I think to some degree it is really challenging to be at the state level and feel like you can, conduct oversight, gather the facts that are needed, and really use it to solve problems, because we've got a very complex federal system. A lot of the authority and the money is coming from the federal government. And so, and oftentimes implementation is actually all the way down to the local level. And so if you're sort of in the middle of that and the state level, you lack the resources and staffing that Layla has talked about, but you also are in this sort of web where the handoff is not very good from the federal government. There are a lot of mandates, a lot of requirements, but not a lot of help in terms of how to kind of manage the data, because data is the kind of the mother's milk of oversight. You can't get it done without it. And yet a lot of times you really need support from these other branches of these other levels of government, the federal government, and then also local government. So I think it's the complexity of it. And then a third thing I will definitely mention is just simply a lack of understanding that the job of a lawmaker is really threefold. It's representation. It certainly is legislating, but it's oversight as well. And a lot of lawmakers don't get that third one. They focus a lot on how many bills they've passed, and too often that's the way the media focuses on things. If you haven't passed a whole bunch of bills, then you're less effective. Yet, really, I think the public is more interested. They don't care about the bills you pass. They care about the problems you're solving, the extent to which you're really listening and representing them. So there's a lot to be done there, and I know our time is limited, but I would say those kinds of challenges and really a need to, as far as how to address them, working together across your chamber. So reaching out to people and trying to share resources and pool your capacity is one very important thing to do. You've got to set priorities. You can't do oversight on everything. You've got to decide, and you need to make a plan in advance. And a lot of the work we do with states is to try to encourage them and show them how, and help them sometimes fashion a plan so that they can pick their battles and really do the oversight on things that's really crucial. And finally, we're building a national community so that Oregon can learn from Nebraska. And instead of everybody being in their own state silo, they can actually share best practices. Obviously, this is a big part of what my colleagues are doing in their organizations, and it very much applies to oversight.
Yeah. No, that's, I think, one area in particular. I know that you've had some stellar oversight specialist in the overseeing the child welfare system, which in so many states is kind of fundamentally broken, and that's a place in particular where I've kind of observed breakthroughs in different states kind of spilling over to other states. So in some ways, this is a little bit about recovering the laboratories of democracy ethos that Justice Brenda
Absolutely
talked about. By the way, I appreciate that. Apologies to anyone who's tried to leave a question. The Q&A function is now open, and I know I have a few friends in the audience, so I'm going to encourage everyone, especially folks who I don't want to cold call anyone, but we'd welcome any questions you might have for our panelists. Feel free to drop those in. And then while you're doing that, one last question, Debbie, for you, as you look across, and you've been at this, now for many years, if you could wave a magic wand and bring about a change that would make life easier for the New Deal leaders you're currently supporting, and help other leaders like them that aren't in politics and don't envision at present what future in politics that could lead them to kind of come in and raise their hand and run for office. What would that one change be from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, I think I would say that I'd start by just saying that I completely echo everything that's been said earlier, and particularly some of the stuff Layla was talking about just the support and how hard it is to make it work to be an elected official. And it's been heartening to see some of the legislation or at least conversations that are starting to happen about things like childcare, or other things, either whether you're running for office or you're serving in office. And that's a big part. But I think that if I had a magic wand, the thing that I would address really goes to kind of Layla's third point, and that Jim echoed as well, which is just the environment in which we're finding ourselves needing to govern. I'd say a couple things. One is I am heartened and continue to be heartened by how many people are stepping up, not in spite of what's happening, but because of what's happening. I hear a lot from particularly newer New Deal leaders, young. Our leaders skew young. They're not all Gen Z or millennial, but they skew young because they're future rising stars. But how many of them have said to me that they got into politics because of what's happening? They're worried about the country. They're worried about the direction of the country. A little bit kind of like I felt like after 9/11 and kind of a lot of people stepping up to military service. There feels to be a little bit of that stepping up to civic service when we know that democracy is under threat, democracy is being attacked. And so that is heartening. But I fear that if we don't change the conversation, if we don't change the physical threats that are happening to elected officials, which I see a lot of, Layla mentioned it too, but one friend of mine, mayor of Wichita, Kansas, just to take one example, it's happened all over the place, had a very credible death threat against he and his family with young kids when he was mayor because of the mask mandate he ordered for his city. And, that's not, unfortunately, an isolated incident. So when we're seeing things like that, I do worry about people's ability to continue to step up and run and to put, their physical safety or that of their family at risk. So a magic wand for me would be that, that we just change the dialogue in this country to understand that, that this is, what's so crazy to me is that we're all in this together, right? This is our governance, right? We're all in this together. We have to make this work. And so, be able to change the conversation to a place where we could disagree respectfully, where where there's not this idea that it's two teams and we're just going to fight each other. And so I would just say, for me, everybody on this call, like I'm just watching my own language. I'm watching my own, when I'm seeing something, I'm calling it out. When there's opportunity to talk about the good that's happening, when government does something right instead of something wrong, let's tweet about that. So I think there's ways that each one of us can kind of help change the norm and change the conversation. And I think that's really what has to happen.
Well, thank you. No, that's a really helpful answer, and drawing on the depth of your experience too. It's really helpful there, Debbie. We have some questions. I appreciate folks opening up the questions here. Let me just read them, and then what I might just do, just in the spirit of being able to work through them, let's just take the first one here. It's from our friend Bridget Zorn from Oklahoma. She asked, what is the current best thinking or any new innovation when it comes to elected leaders effectively communicating with voters on the good policy governance work that they are doing? So any of our panelists want to take the first crack at that one that you want to speak to?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in very briefly.
Sure.
Thank you for that question. And I I read this article in the New York Times like years ago, and I was just like laughing to myself because I feel like once it's in the New York Times, it's like, oh my gosh, this is like, they're so behind the times. But it was a whole article about something called deep canvassing, which is essentially like a long conversation with a constituent about what they care about. The New York Times was essentially reinventing having a conversation like a normal human with somebody else. And I would say, for lawmakers who are doing this sort of connecting with voters really well, that's what they're doing. They're asking questions. They're listening more than they're talking. It's like being on a first date, right? Like if you go on a first date and the other person's just talking about themselves the whole time, you're not really going to have a connection with them. You're not going to be engaged. You're probably not going to have a second date. But if they're truly and authentically engaging with you, showing up where you are and interested in the things that you care about, and then relating future things back to those same things that you said you cared about, that to me is some of the most effective leadership. It's harder because you can't just spend a bunch of money around election day to convince people to vote for you. You actually have to do a lot of engagement in between elections. But to me, that is the New York Times certainly thought it was an innovation. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. I think that's just having a conversation, but really sort of listening more than you're talking, to me, feels like the key to getting back on the right track here.
Excellent.
I'd love to just jump in to mention a couple of ideas, because I think this is really a good question. One of those is we held a symposium about a week ago where we brought together scholars and practitioners, and the scholars presented papers and the practitioners commented on those papers. And one of those papers was a really interesting analysis where the scholar embedded herself in a state legislative office in Virginia and tested, did some statistical analysis to test a thing she's calling proactive constituent service. And this is an idea where you harness a legislator will use limited staff. We know the staff is very small, but also volunteers and other people who have been on the campaign to actually engage in constituent service, initially just doing outreach. So asking people how they're doing. So the traditional model of constituent service, for those who don't know, is the legislator just waits for constituents to come in with complaints. Instead, the proactive constituent service idea is to reach out to people along the lines of what Layla was describing in this New York Times article, to ask people how it's going, and to then use data techniques to separate the people who really have a concern that needs acting upon versus those who just wanted to be heard. And you get a much better engagement with people and a much better reaction from the public in terms of how they view the public sector.
Yep.
So that's one thing I'd love to mention. And then the other is a person that's a mutual friend of ours is Jennifer Polka's book around analyzing the end user of government services. So to the extent that we can focus government on how the end user is experiencing government, I think there is a way in which left and right can find some common ground in serving that need. So those would be the two things I would
And Dan, if I can just jump in, I'll be really brief, but I would echo those. And I would also say, I mean, we're doing a lot of work right now looking at AI and how AI, I mean, there's a lot of conversations about AI and privacy and guardrails, but there's also AI really making government work better. A couple examples, just being able to send or communicate with people in different languages all at once, right? Ways to make customer service interfacing with the government so much better. So that's something we're looking at a lot. And I think there's some really promising and exciting opportunities there. And one other thing I'd mention too is probably a whole symposium on just this one, but on what this conversation, but also I'm finding a lot of our elected leaders taking on the role of actual civic education a little bit. We have multiple New Deal leaders who have either their own podcasts or their own, regular webinars where they interview people within their city or within their state about what they do, and just trying to help make constituents understand how government works and how to engage with government, or government citizen advisory panels, engaging people. So I'm seeing a lot of really exciting things of people trying to connect with and engage their constituents that I think are really promising.
No,
I love that, Debbie. And there's like evils of social media are very easy to extol, but I think there are lawmakers like Jeff Jackson in North Carolina, others who use social media really effectively to demystify what's happening inside the institution. So +1 to what you just said.
Yeah, and I'd encourage everyone, I know he's, as I understand it, he's now running for Attorney General of North Carolina, but Jeff Jackson, who's currently a member of Congress, has a just absolute terrific Substack that is the clearest explication of so much complicated stuff happening in DC, that he just has a knack for translating it so that his constituents in North Carolina can just readily make sense of it. I think that's a great example, Layla. Next question from Paz Magat, the Patriots and Pragmatists Network, asked, she would love to hear more about what kind of incentive and permission structures exist that electeds can reinforce to push up a broader culture of cooperation. So what whether it's incentives or permission structures, where do those exist to help further a broader culture of cooperation at the state and local level? And I guess, Layla, I might turn to you on this one, just because in many respects, the ethos of your future caucuses, I mean, you're intentionally bringing together, both people across parties, and it sounds silly, but across chambers, which often can be as much, if not more, of a divide. So how do your future caucuses kind of set the stage for collaboration, or give permission for collaboration, if you will?
Yeah. There's 3 things that we do that I think are sort of transferable. One is, as I mentioned earlier, finding a shared generational identity rather than the shared partisan identity creates a new permission structure within which collaboration and cooperation can happen, right? So saying, oh, we're young people, what do we share as, folks who have that shared lived experience, can help transcend some of the other artificial barriers that looking at ourselves as like a Democrat and a Republican might otherwise introduce. And we've seen that in all of our states, that sort of having that infrastructure of the Future Caucus to say this is a place for young people to get to know one another, to meet, has ultimately led to really, impactful legislation on everything from maternal health to climate to taxes to democracy itself. So I think a shared identity is really important, even if you want to say our shared identity is we're all from this neighborhood or from this state, using something to create that superordinate identity is really critical. The second is having an abundance mindset. And so thinking about like, what is it that you're co-creating? What is it that you're building? That gets people excited about doing something together, rather than sort of a deficit mindset, breaking, which can feel like you're cleaning up somebody else's mess, or you're having to fix something that's broken. It's less energizing to approach things in that way than it is to say, what is something new that we can build together that we'll have because of our efforts. And that is work that we do a lot through our policy innovation lab, sort of helping people think about like, what can you now as young people who have this shared identity as forward-thinking leaders, what can you now bring and co-create that will be really exciting. And then the third thing is at the end of the day, and everybody knows this, like people want to win, right? That you need to be able to go back to your district and sell a win. And so aligning the way you talk about cooperation and collaboration and bipartisanship with delivering a clear-cut win that is going to make lives better, that is going to make people happy, that you can celebrate, that you can like pound the table and say, like, look what we got. That messaging is absolutely important psychologically for people to feel excited about compromise, which otherwise can feel like kind of like milquetoast and sort of insufficient. And I think it's really important positive reinforcement for the electeds themselves to feel like all of the work of coming together was really worth it, to feel like, wow, we're really celebrating it. People are excited. The sort of like messaging is critical as well. So shared identity, abundance mindset, and clear messaging.
Yes, and we've got we're unfortunately coming to the end of our appointed hour here. We appreciate all the other additional questions that have come in. People should feel free to follow up with me at daniel.stid@gmail.com or any of our other panelists, and we can kind of follow up with particular answers here. One of the things where I just wanted to flag one question that came in from POW, the Scholar Strategy Network. Layla's flagged for you. This is about where can you actually boost. Where have we seen examples of boosting pay and compensation? Kansas is a current great case study, as Layla mentioned. And I think one of the things that this broader network of nonprofits that are working to try and figure out how to support these up and coming leaders. I think one of the things that we want to spend some more time thinking about is what could we collectively do to kind of give voice and kind of stand in the corner of these lawmakers for whom it's tricky to argue for kind of reasonable pay, but until we kind of could get that more uniformly distributed, it'll be one of the barriers, as Layla mentioned. So that's another way of saying if any people in the audience, again, are at all interested in this, would like to learn more about this kind of nascent network of groups working on this, feel free to email me at daniel.stid@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to kind of give you an update on what's occurring and talk about opportunities to plug in. But for now, what I want to do is thank all the participants who have stayed with us, the folks who asked the great questions, and then also Layla, Jim, and Debbie for the great comments. We're so appreciative of your contributions in your day jobs and these networks that you're leading, and also to the essays for the symposium. Michael, any last words from Democracy Journal?
Oh, great conversation, and we're proud to facilitate it, and let's keep it going.
Okay. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Much.
Thank you.